LinkedIn News.
I think part of our purpose here as this entity, this unit of a person and a thing, it is to be a transformer of energy. And every time we eat, that's what we're doing. That's what metabolism is. It's taking energy outside of us. I mean, us is really an illusion too, right? Because we're kind of this constantly dynamic, buzzing hive of matter that's constantly exchanging energy and matter with the surrounding world in total connection. But when we eat, we're taking in this potential energy from the outside world, from food, which basically is from the cosmos, right? It's outside of us. And we're converting it to a different energy that allows us to power all our feelings, all our thoughts, all our business ventures, everything, and reach our highest purpose, hopefully. It's having the energy to fuel the ability to really seek that higher calling of like, where are we? How are we connected with everything?
So that's Dr. Casey Means. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Make sure you hit that follow button to get new episodes of our podcast every week. Stay tuned for a bold new vision for optimizing our health now and in the future. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts to learn how we can improve ourselves, our relationship to others, and the world around us. Today, Dr. Casey Means, a Stanford-trained physician, as well as co-founder and chief medical officer at Metabolic health company Levels, is joining us to challenge the way we think about our health and to bring our metabolism back to healthy functioning. Now, I know a lot of our listeners, like you, may be under 50, and so you're thinking that this isn't relevant yet. Or maybe you're not dealing with any chronic illnesses or symptoms. But Dr. Means says this is exactly when she wished everyone started learning more about their metabolic health. Casey says we have to change the fundamental way we look first at our symptoms and next how we think about healthcare. So Casey is going to give us a re-edification of what metabolism actually is. Yes, we went back to biology class because I forgot to. Why we should care about it, and how to figure out your own health by simply asking your doctors for results to specific biomarkers. These are ways we can understand if things are functioning well or not functioning well. Ultimately, Casey wants us to achieve what she's titled her new book, Good Energy. Her framework is accessible to any of you wanting to optimize how your body functions. Here's Casey.
The biggest intention for this work is to just really improve human thriving and planetary thriving. We are in a really tough spot right now. People are getting sicker every single year in our country, and we're spending more and more money on the issue, and more research is being done, and every single year the outcomes are getting worse. And I believe there's actually a really quite straightforward answer to really reimagine the future of health, both for people and the planet. And that is what my work is surrounded around. And I approach this from the angle of being a physician who was in the conventional healthcare system for almost 10 years and really think there's a different way that we can be practicing that really empowers people to understand their own bodies better and get back in touch with the incredible healing potential of the body so we can live our happiest, healthiest, most energized lives.
At the beginning of your book, and you've shared the story of your mom, you dedicate your book to your mom. So would you mind just sharing a little bit of how you got here through that experience?
So my mom, her story is almost like archetypal of, I think, what so many Americans are going through today, which is sort of this intense reliance on the healthcare system, but not getting the outcomes they want. Being sort of faithfully going through the doors of the doctors and the specialists, but not actually getting better or really achieving the incredible health outcomes that they want. So with my mom's story, her health journey really started about age 40, where she had me and I was a 12-pound baby. I was really large, 11 pounds, 9 ounces to be exact. And everyone just chalked that up to like, oh my gosh, that's congratulations, you had a big baby. She had a lot of trouble losing the baby weight after that, sort of weight loss resistance, then had a really tough menopause, hot flashes, mood symptoms, sleep symptoms, when she turned around 50. Then as she got older in her 60s, she kind of started racking up these classic American diagnoses. She had high cholesterol and they gave her a statin. She had high blood pressure. They gave her an ACE inhibitor. Then she got high blood sugar and they said, oh, this is prediabetes. Here's metformin. And these are medications that are prescribed literally hundreds of millions of times per year in the US. And then just after turning 70, she had like very uncharacteristic stomach pain that she hadn't had before. It lasted for a few days and she went to the doctor and they ordered a CT scan and she got a text message with her results a few hours later, and she had stage 4 widely metastatic pancreatic cancer. 13 days after that CT scan, she was dead. This was about 3 years ago. At the time of her death, she was seeing what people would say are best doctors in the country, best institutions in the country. And the doctors really kind of looked at us as a family and said, we're so sorry. This is so unlucky that your mom had this sort of premature death. And I think what I really am here to share as a physician and as someone who has been deep inside that system is that it's really not unlucky. The cancer was actually totally predictable. If we had looked at her lifetime of different symptoms and diseases through a slightly different lens, in our Western medical system and our conventional healthcare system, we're really obsessed with silos and we're obsessed with fragmentation. We have over 42 medical subspecialties, and wherever your symptom is, you're usually going to be sent to a different doctor. It's built in on every level to the way we're both taught medicine and the way we're taught to think about the body and the way we practice. Very reactive, very whack-a-mole, very, very siloed. Through a different lens, which is really what I call a good energy lens or a metabolic framework. There's lots of words for this: systems biology, network biology, looking at the connections between diseases on more of a physiologic level, more of a cellular level, rather than on a symptom level. What we actually find is that what the science tells us is that many of these symptoms and diseases we're facing in the Western world today are actually totally connected by pretty similar physiology, just showing up in different parts of the body, in different cell types. So they look like different things, but inside the cell on the very core level, they're actually quite similar. So what I would argue is that we need to look at so many of the things we're facing and suffering from today, ranging from the non-lethal annoyances like fatigue and migraine and depression and anxiety and gout and belly fat, all the way to the top killers in our country like stroke and cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's dementia and type 2 diabetes and chronic liver disease, as on a spectrum of a very similar root cause, which is metabolic dysfunction. And that's something that is the biggest blind spot in healthcare today, the connected nature between these diseases. And the beautiful thing is that we actually can really understand our metabolic health, this sort of like how our cells really tick. The healthcare system isn't really helping us understand it because it's not the goggles that they have to look at the body. But that's what we need to do if we really want to heal. And the nice part is that if we focus on that one issue, a lot of stuff can get better. And so it actually makes things a lot simpler for people, which is actually, it's a very hopeful message.
Your work is confronting some big beliefs that we've all held for so long. And what you're arguing and saying is that actually these aren't the whole picture, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I would say the thing that I'm confronting most deeply is a culture of disconnection on every level. The disconnection on one level is the fact that we have built a system of healthcare, which it's the largest and fastest growing industry in the United States.
I think most people don't think of healthcare as an industry. We think of it as there are doctors. Those doctors are here to help me and they help me get better. So can you even unpack that a little bit before you move on to the other things you're confronting?
Healthcare is 100% a business, and it's the biggest business in the United States. It's $4.3 plus trillion. It's over 20% of the largest GDP in human history. And what people need to understand as they approach that system is that there's one way that healthcare system grows, and that is having more patients in the system, having more things done to them for longer periods of time. That's how healthcare is financed, by paying for services. Because of that financial incentive, which is, an invisible hand on every aspect of healthcare, from the way research is done, how doctors are trained, to how we practice, how guidelines are made. Because that's built in on every level, what it does is it puts really insidious blinders on everyone, from patients to doctors, to see things a certain way. Think about this. If someone like my mother, who had a huge baby, which is clinically defined as fetal macrosomia, literally big-bodied baby, which portends metabolic issues in both the mother and child. It's a clinical issue, a huge baby, not being able to lose the baby weight, weight loss resistance, bad menopause symptoms, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, and cancer. Think about the difference in the financial outcome if each of those issues are treated separately by separate doctors, separate doctor visits, and if we can manage those diseases with a pill that she basically has to take for life because it's a chronic medication, versus if we put on a root cause set of goggles or metabolic goggles and actually we're treating based on core physiology rather than treating on symptoms, theoretically, there's a world in which she could really learn all the dietary and lifestyle choices that fundamentally affect metabolism, have cells that are working fundamentally better, and maybe actually get out of a lot of those doctors' offices. That's not really good for the business model. That's not recurring revenue. This is not to say, people should abandon their doctors in any way. What it is to say is that every single consumer of healthcare services should be aware of what the incentives of the system they're engaging with are, so they can just have full eyes open and make informed decisions about the way they're being handled and be more empowered to make decisions for themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that oftentimes we, even though it's so glaringly obvious, don't think about healthcare being a business. We think about it as a thing that we use when we need to, that's meant to keep us well, versus something that is incentivized from a financial perspective. I'd love to move to something that I do know that you're confronting, which is our idea of health, the introduction of metabolic health. As you describe this, that so many of us do not have great metabolic health and don't even know what it is. So tell me what metabolic health is versus the way that we've historically looked at what health is.
I think a really important concept for just everyone to understand is what this concept of metabolism means. So metabolism is this very core process. It's the most foundational process in our entire body, which is how we convert food energy, so the potential energy stored in food, into cellular energy, which is energy we can actually use to power our bodies. We're a big machine of around 40 trillion cells, and each cell is like a little city or factory, and they all require energy to function, energy in the form of a chemical compound called ATP. So if we can effectively convert literally the 70 metric tons of food we eat in a lifetime, if we can convert that properly day in and day out to a currency of energy that we can pay for all these chemical reactions, then we have a well-powered set of these little factories, all these 40 trillion cells, and the bubbling up of all those chemical reactions working properly, happening properly, that's a healthy life. If we have well-powered cells that are doing all the jobs they're meant to do, that is the foundation of all health. Once metabolism goes badly and we have underpowering, you cannot get around that. That is going to be a problem because we have an underpowered city, factory, machine, et cetera. So metabolism is the most fundamental set of chemical reactions that then power everything else in the body. In America today, 93% of American adults have metabolic dysfunction, meaning a problem with how they convert that 70 metric tons of potential energy into energy we can actually use. And so when you look at the science, when you look at the data, almost every single leading cause of premature death in the United States and many of the symptoms that people are showing up for in the doctor's offices today are directly tied to metabolic dysfunction on that intracellular level. So here's the piece to kind of put that together. Well, how could cancer and Alzheimer's and arthritis and depression and anxiety and gout and infertility and erectile dysfunction, how could this all be related? It's very simple. We have over 200 cell types in the body. So, we start as one cell and it differentiates into over 200 different types of cells. They're all doing different things. They all need energy to function. And so if a core foundational process like powering is dysfunctional in a glial cell in the brain versus an ovarian theca cell, those are going to look like different issues, right? One's going to show up in the ovary as something and one's going to show up in the brain as something. So the fact that we have all these different cell types means that we can have all these different looking symptoms. And the blind spot in healthcare is that when we initially were describing all these symptoms and categorizing diseases over the past couple hundred years, we didn't have the technology to understand what was like truly going on inside the cell. The best we could do is describe diseases based on collections of symptoms. So if you think about like, how is depression defined? It's defined by the presence of a particular set of symptoms. And we basically need an update to the way we think about and describe diseases, because now we can actually describe them based on what's truly going on inside the cell. We could describe diseases based on what's actually foundationally causing them, but we're still describing them based on the symptoms, which means we see them as fragmented. So what I'm calling for, and the real reimagination of the healthcare system's approach, would be to say, let's update. Let's actually describe the trunk of the tree of all these branches that are related on the physiologic level and treat at that level. Because if we did that, we could actually heal. We could actually get to the root cause rather than mitigate symptoms, which doesn't necessarily actually heal the core physiology that's happening inside the cell. So metabolism, how we convert food to energy; metabolic dysfunction, problem with how we power our cells. And then the reason it's showing up as so many different things is because of foundational process dysfunction is happening in so many different cell types, so it looks like different things. And then the very final piece of this puzzle that people need to understand is that the reason this is happening, and the reason it's happening over basically the last 50 to 75 years when all of these chronic diseases have exploded, is because the rapid change in our environment, mostly since World War II, last 75 years or so many aspects of our environment and the rapid technological advancements, so to speak, are synergistically hurting the metabolic machinery of our cells, the mitochondria, the literal thing that converts the food energy to cellular energy. And that's across all domains of our environment: food, moving to ultra-processed food; soil, depleting our soil, our food is nutrient depleted; sleep, we're getting 25% less sleep on average than we were 100 years ago; environmental toxins, there's 80,000 new synthetic environmental toxins in our environment in the past 100 years. Chronic stress, we have fear-inducing media streamed to our phones 24 hours a day. So across every spectrum, food, sleep, movement, stress, toxins, light, and temperature, they are all uniquely pointing an arrow at the part of the cell that makes energy. And that's why we're so sick. Anything that doesn't approach that change in environment will never actually heal us. And so that's what we need to modernize and move towards in our healthcare system and as individuals.
So this stat of 93% of Americans experiencing metabolic dysfunction is shocking at first. And then as I start to think about it, I go, well, it's sort of insidious. We know people who are experiencing depression or autoimmune or all of these other things that feel like, oh, that's just what happens. And so it becomes so normal. So, I think there's this group of people called the worried well, right? And so those people can span all age ranges. But I feel like in general, what we're talking about tends to be conversations that happen among people who are older in age. And it seems like the reason that you're creating this conversation now is that we can be better at preventing this if we care earlier.
Absolutely. I think what people also need to realize is that a lot of the things we've chalked up to normal life in America, and we are actually just accepting, are totally not normal. We are meant to be happy, healthy, energetic, thriving, high on life. And we have so lowered the expectation for what is normal that I think a lot of young people are just not even realizing in some sense that they are sick. So Mark Hyman, he's an amazing physician author who's written 19 books about health. He says we've all just sort of become accustomed to having FLC syndrome, which is just feel like crap syndrome. 40% of 18-year-olds now have basically meet criteria for a mental health disorder, and 75% of adults are overweight or obese, and 50% of Americans, so this means a lot of younger Americans, have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And if you look at doctor's visits, the number one cause for a primary care doctor visit is just vague feelings of feeling fatigue. None of this is normal. And a framework that I really think is so important for people to internalize fully is that symptoms, any symptoms cannot arise in a vacuum. They don't arise out of thin air. They arise necessarily out of cellular dysfunction. We get symptoms. Symptoms are the way our body speaks to us about cellular dysfunction. And one of the ways that our cells become dysfunctional is very simple. This is first principles. They are not getting what they need to function properly, or they are being overburdened with too much of something that they cannot process. And so there's some sort of dysfunction that ensues. When you have a symptom, a headache, knee pain, a fever, Indigestion. What's the first thing that comes to everyone's mind in America? Squash it. Get the antacid. Get the Advil. That is our universal American way of doing things without any curiosity about what does that symptom mean? What is my body asking me for? So to kind of get back to your question, I think it's not just about prevention. It's about a wholesale reimagination of the relationship with our bodies and listening to it and trusting it and realizing that a lot of these low-grade symptoms that we need to see as real warning signs for what could be a much louder signal down the road and not as isolated things. So we need to actually start seeing those connections because a healthcare system does not have root cause goggles on. So unless we advocate, we're often going to find ourselves in many different specialists' office giving us different pills, not talking about how to truly meet the needs of our cells or stop overwhelming the cells.
So for people who are saying, oh, I'm not experiencing symptoms, we've compared this with the 93% of Americans, right, having metabolic dysfunction. So it's very likely that we have something going on, but they're going, I'm not experiencing any symptoms. And therefore, I just go about my life how I go about my life. What should you say we should be looking for that would sort of signal to us that something might be off?
Well, I would say for those people, that's amazing. That's the goal. We want to feel effing awesome, and we can. What I would say is that it is useful, I think, for everyone to take a look at some of the very easily accessible biomarkers that can help us understand whether we're part of that 93% or not. And I think given how big that number is, it's actually quite useful for kind of everyone to do the exercise. And the stats that I'm referencing about 93% of people who are not optimally metabolically healthy, that's coming straight from the American College of Cardiology. That is data that was published just about a year and a half ago. And what they did was they looked at like a set of very cheap, very easily accessible biomarkers that give us like a clue into our metabolic health that we can all basically go up and look at our last physical or annual exam where they ordered basic labs, and you probably can find all this information. So I'll just briefly run through kind of how they categorize that, because each one of us needs to know whether we're part of that 93% or not. Because if we're not, it's going to lead to challenges in our life, and we should work to get back to it. So the way they categorized that was you basically had to meet all these 7 criteria not on medication. So it was a BMI less than 25. BMI is not a perfect marker for sure, but that was one that they used. Waist circumference less than 88 centimeters in women or less than or equal to 102 centimeters in men. And I believe that's 35 inches in women and 40 inches in men. Fasting glucose less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. Hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average marker of blood sugar levels, that was less than 5.7%. Then they did a total cholesterol to HDL ratio. So these are both on a standard cholesterol panel. You take the HDL cholesterol and the total cholesterol, and you divide total cholesterol by HDL, and it had to be less than 3.5 to 1. And then systolic blood pressure less than 120, diastolic blood pressure less than 80. So basically less than 120 over 80. And then no history of like cardiovascular disease or heart attack, stroke, chest pain, things like that. So those were the criteria. If you were not on medication for any metabolic issues, so like blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication, blood sugar medication, and those were all true, you're part of the 6.8% of Americans who they would call metabolically healthy. So it's a very small percentage. And those are all numbers that are determined almost exclusively by our daily choices. So we really need to, as a country and as individuals, know exactly where we are on those biomarkers every year. And if they're not optimal, we need to be focusing on a metabolic strategy to improve them.
And when we go to the doctor, can we get all of these done or do something specific to get access to these biomarkers?
These are super straightforward, super simple biomarkers that your doctor will not argue with you about. These are things that altogether would cost probably like less than $100 to get. And actually on many insurance plans as part of the annual physical, like basic labs are included. So many of these are actually free. So what you'd be asking for is a cholesterol panel, a fasting glucose, and a hemoglobin A1C. And that will include all the things. And then you, of course, need to do waist circumference, and BMI includes weight and blood pressure. So quite simple. And there's certainly a lot more advanced metabolic testing you can do, which I talk about in the book extensively. Fasting insulin and CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, and liver function testing and uric acid. And those are actually also fairly cheap tests, but at a very baseline minimum, the ones I mentioned are super easily accessible.
Great. So we have our own snapshot. And I think about, especially as I read your work, and I often talk to people who are challenging the way that we as a society, as a system, kind of show up. So what I hear you saying is the way that things are structured today, the systems we have are not incentivized in any large way for us to be healthy. So when you consider like what you would say to someone who's not in this field, not in this world, maybe none of these tests make any sense to them, or they don't really know anything aside from BMI. What are the choices that they need to make on a regular basis, as you mentioned, that can support them getting closer to metabolic health?
Great question. I mean, first of all, I would just say, and I love what you just said, like it's a systems issue. It's not an individual person issue, because I know at this point, hundreds, maybe thousands of doctors from my time in the healthcare system, and everyone's a good person, right? Everyone went into medicine to help people. And that's what's so troubling about it, is that it's a system that's designed to have a certain outcome. And so unfortunately, we're all kind of working within that system that feels almost too complicated to shift. And systems are very important, and the doctors who may even be not, focusing on a metabolic lens to health, doing their best, and they're practicing, the medicine they were taught. And so it's a tough situation, right? And it's not just the healthcare system, right? It's also the food system, which is also a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And it's a revolving door, because industrial food system profits off us being addicted to ultra-processed food and eating ourselves to death, which is what's happening. And we're going against all our evolutionary instincts to basically gorge ourselves with food to the point where we get sick. And that's totally that's in just benefits the food industry, not people. So all that leads me to say the simplest thing, literally the simplest thing that people can do to start to get off this cycle is to eat real, unprocessed, organic food. Because when you do that, when you start to put in 70 metric tons of potential energy into your body that's actually real, like actual unprocessed, not factory created, not chemically laden food. And organic is actually quite important. It's not frivolous. The reason that's important is because over 19 billion pounds of toxic pesticides have been sprayed on the global food system, 19 billion pounds. And when you cover the food supply with a known toxin, there's going to be bad outcomes. So you want organic because you just want to get rid of that, which is crushing our microbiome, which can be toxic on several biologic levels. Almost more importantly, it kills the biodiversity of the soil. It's a pesticide. It's a killer of pests. So it's literally, its defined purpose is to reduce biodiversity. And unfortunately, what puts the nutrients into our food is the soil health. It's the thriving soil. So it's not like a frivolous thing to choose organic food. It's not only good for the nutrient density of the food, it's removing a toxin from the food. And if you want to care about something other than yourself, farmers are getting so sick, cancer, many other diseases, because they're having to handle these. So do it for them too. So basically making as much of that food that you're eating unprocessed and safer. What that does, why it starts a virtuous cycle, is because we actually have totally exquisite satiety mechanisms in our body. Like our gut is lined with cells that are just looking for nutrients. And when they actually get the nutrients they need, they will secrete satiety hormones to make you not hungry. We talk about Ozempic and Wegovy and all these things. They're GLP-1 agonists, but our body makes its own GLP-1. However, it requires getting the right nutrients to secrete that. So when we're eating ultra-processed garbage, your body's not getting the signals it needs to produce that hormone effectively. So it creates a virtuous cycle of being essentially less hungry because your body's needs are getting met. The cells are actually getting what they need. Imagine if you're eating this nutrient-depleted, ultra-processed stuff, the body's not really getting what it needs, what it actually needs to function. So it's going to push you to eat until it can get what it needs. But if you just keep eating processed food, it's not. So we're literally eating ourselves into a grave. So I would say the very first thing is focusing on real food and getting the highest quality food that we possibly can.
On the food piece, you talked about confusion, which I think is so common. The confusion around organic foods, I think, huge. So, for example, we go buy organic eggs, and you hear from some people that organic eggs don't matter, and then organic eggs are really important. We go buy organic food, and people say, well, yeah, it's great that it's organic, but actually the pesticides through the process of precipitation, but then it rains down on all the organic food.
Yeah.
Can you just give us a little bit more on that?
Yeah. What I would say is that if you can move away from ultra processed foods, so ultra processed foods, essentially, it's almost 70% of our grocery stores. And it's the foods that are going through a factory basically before they get to you. The definition of an ultra processed food is that an original food was broken down into its constituent parts, like a starch, and then re-put together with other constituent parts and chemicals to create something new. So if you can just move away from the ultra-processed foods, that's number one. Just looking at labels and not eating anything that you cannot visualize, like the word that you don't understand. Just get rid of all of it. Red 40, get rid of it. Maltodextrin, get rid of it. A word you can't pronounce, just don't eat it because it will confuse your body. So that's step one. The next step would be, yes, organic, because even though it might be in the rainwater and this and that, not having the chemicals sprayed directly on your food, and then especially through processing, it can concentrate that. That's a great first step. This is all about minimizing our exposure to these things that are overwhelming our cells. Living in the modern world today, we're going to be exposed to certain toxins. So it's about doing what we can and then really starting to focus on the highest quality, nutrient-dense food that we can. So micronutrient rich. And that means trying to get it as close to the source as possible. If people have access to it, the best possible thing you can do is buy your food from a farmer's market. And the reason that's not frivolous, it's actually part of our healthcare strategy, is because the average piece of food in the United States is transported 1,500 miles to your plate. Every day it's out of the ground, it's losing nutrient density. It's losing the vitamins, the antioxidants, the things that are literally the medicine for your cells, to help them be resilient and protect them and to help metabolic function. So if you can go talk to a farmer at the farmer's market and the food was picked recently, it's not sprayed with pesticides, and it's in its whole food form, like that is more important than any dietary dogma out there, any label for a diet, just eating that food that is filled with the molecular information that your body's expecting and needs to function properly. So that's kind of the way I think about it. And the first thing people will often say is like, I don't have time and I don't have money. And I totally understand that. There are ways to do this cheaply. I get 4 pounds of organic cauliflower rice at Costco for $8. There's ways to do it. And frozen foods can be really good because they actually often have high nutrient density because they're frozen very soon after being picked. And one tip for farmers markets is that a lot of farmers will not actually be certified organic because that's a very expensive and bureaucratic process, but they're not spraying any pesticides. So just talk to them and say, hey, do you spray synthetic toxicides? They say no. Their food's often half as cheap because they haven't had to go through the certification, but it still doesn't have the bad stuff on it. So, just kind of getting really creative. And also remembering that the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is healthcare issues. Like healthcare problems are extremely expensive. And I'm not the first person to have said this, but you kind of pay now or you pay later. So really thinking about healthy food is a really important investment for reaching our, highest potential health-wise.
We're taking a quick break. We'll be right back with Dr. Casey Means. And we're back with Dr. Casey Means. So you've spent a lot of time on food, and I completely understand why, because you've explained this entire metabolic process and how we can most impact it through food. What are some other ways that we should be thinking about ensuring we have proper metabolic functioning?
Yeah. So I would say the main vectors to think about are food, sleep, movement, emotional health and stress, toxin exposure, light, and temperature. So those are kind of all the ones I talk about in my book, Good Energy, because they all represent ways that we communicate with our cells on a daily basis. What is the world that this body of all these cells is experiencing? And those are the main vectors that we can control to give the cells what they're expecting and need. So when you think about sleep, the modern world has put our body into sort of this circadian disarray. We're diurnal animals, which means we have a two-phase biology, one that is stimulated by light and one that's stimulated by dark. And that's encoded on the deepest layer of our biology. That is just like hardwired into our metabolic and genetic activity. And what that looks like is that when our bodies are exposed to certain frequencies of light and photon energy, when your eyeballs are exposed to sun, that photon hits your cone cells in your retina, sends a action potential back to your brain, your suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that is actually a master regulator of which genes and activities are going to be turned on throughout your whole body during the day. So super foundational to just a functioning body. If you look at the way our life is now, the average American is spending 93% of their time indoors. 93%. And it doesn't matter if there's windows, because windows are a physical block to photon energy, and it will just exponentially decrease the amount of that light energy that your body's getting. So if you think about light being a signal to your brain and therefore your genes and your cellular signaling activity of what to do at what time, we're inside 93% of the time. We're rarely going outside during the day. And we have blue light from our devices that's now on after the sun goes down. So we get less light when the body's expecting it because we're not going outdoors. And then we're blasting our suprachiasmatic nucleus with light that makes it think it might be daytime late at night. And that confusion to our core biology is so unprecedented. So this gets into sleep. It gets into how we basically use these choices to cue our body for proper biology, but also into light. Despite our bodies being on a 24-hour clock naturally, we use certain cues like light and sleep consistency and even meal timing to sort of entrain the body about those things. So one thing I talk about in the book is like really kind of cleaning up some of that circadian biology. And 3 really simple things that people can do is just making sure you're going outside in the morning, no glass barrier. Being in your car with the sun streaming in doesn't count. Like really going outside in that first hour of the day, thinking about that light energy hitting your eyes as an on signal for a lot of really important metabolic processes. Similarly, at night, trying to really dim the lights, put all the devices into dark mode, try and do some red light bulbs if you can at your house because it's not going to have the blue light. Maybe getting the blue light blocking glasses, but really just dimming things after the sun goes down. It's really quite important. And not having any like TVs on in the bedroom or, bright alarm clock lights, just really keeping it dark while you're sleeping. It makes a big difference. And I describe the data of how in the book. Also, trying to really keep a consistent bedtime and wake time. This is another way that we entrain our biologic clock. So trying to go to bed within about an hour window each day and waking up with an hour window each day. There's this really interesting concept of what's called social jet lag, which is basically if we are going to bed at vastly different times each night, like one night 9 p.m., one night midnight, one night 11 p.m., one night 1 a.m., it means essentially the midpoint of our sleep every night is like jumping around. And we want the midpoint of our sleep to be within about 1 hour each night. So if you sleep from 12 to 8, your midpoint is 4 a.m. And what the research shows is that like metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes go up vastly if our social jet lag is more than about 1 to 2 hours. And if we're doing things in our life that we're not really meant to be doing during that diurnal phase, like eating very late at night or like seeing light very late at night, it measurably changes our metabolic health, our insulin sensitivity, our glucose responses to food. There's research that shows that if you eat food during daylight hours, this exact same meal at like 8:30 a.m. versus 9:30 p.m., our glucose response to the food at 8:30 a.m. is much lower than our glucose response if we eat it at 9:30 p.m. Metabolically, that's not the time it's meant to be eating that big meal. And so the body will respond very differently. So from the sleep and light standpoint, it's really about kind of designing our modern life in a way that respects the biologic realities of our cells.
And Casey, does it matter if we go to bed late, or is it just that we ensure we don't experience that social jet lag? So for example, if I go to bed at like 9 p.m., but my partner goes to bed at midnight, does it matter what time?
It's a great question. So there's three aspects of sleep that I talk about in the book that are really important, and it's quality, quantity, and consistency, and all make a difference. And so with consistency, it's about that similar bedtime and wake time to really minimize the social jet lag. Then there's quantity, and the magic number for quantity that seems to matter the most for metabolic health is between 7 to 8 hours asleep. So that doesn't mean that you went to bed at 12 and got up in 7, because there's a lot of time during the night, we don't even realize it, but we're tossing and turning or we're having micro awakenings. So it's really on a sleep tracker, 7 to 8 hours asleep that matters, which probably means being in bed about 8 to 9 hours. And then there's quality, which is how much deep sleep, REM sleep you got. The thing that matters to your question, Leah, is that if we go to bed earlier, we can often front load some of that deep sleep that we might miss if we go to bed a lot later. So I would say if you're sleeping 12 to 8 every day, so 8 hours of sleep, consistent, that's phenomenal. Probably better is moving that up a couple hours because of, our melatonin is getting secreted each night. Usually when the sun goes down, that's when it's like starting to rise. And we want to kind of capture sleep in that time closer to sundown. So the icing on the cake would be maybe moving the sleep up to like 10 p.m., 11 p.m. and keeping the consistency and quantity. But in trying to maximize quality, moving it up can be a little bit better. With that said, the best thing to do is probably to wear a sleep tracker for some period of time and really know for yourself, because people do have, of course, biologic individuality with all of this. And if you're really maximizing deep sleep and REM sleep and optimizing that with a 12 to 8 sleep schedule, that's great.
I know you went through this entire list of all the things that you talk about with food and sleep, and then we talked a bit about light also. Would you also say, like, hey, if you can just change this thing, would you say movement or stress is more important? They're linked.
Oh my gosh.
I'm sure, but yeah.
Yeah, they are linked, right? Because moving definitely helps us with our mental health, but they're both critical. I think one thing to realize is it's really interesting that we are a very exercise-obsessed culture, and yet we're getting sicker and heavier every year. And I actually think there's something around the concept of exercise that we need to realize is very, very modern. It used to be that movement was just built into all aspects of our life. We didn't have cars, so we had to physically move ourselves places to get places. And about 150 years ago, over 70% of the population worked in some way in agriculture. And now it's less than 2% of the population. We're all, knowledge workers now. So the world we're living in has made us sit. And just like that stat I mentioned that is shocking to me, that we spend 93% of our time indoors, we spend over 80% of our 24-hour period sitting, over 80%. The average American is getting only 3,500 to 4,000 steps a day. And so a call to action is we need to realize that our bodies in motion throughout the day is a signal to our biology to do its best work. It keeps us metabolically churning all day. And just exercising for 1 hour, but sitting most of the rest of the day is not the same as a body that's sort of up and moving regularly throughout the day and also exercising, which is great. So we really need to take stock of all the activities we do on a daily basis and just start to think about how could we build more standing or more moving into the activities we're doing every day. And it can literally be writing down what you do every day and then thinking about how to convert certain of them to movement or standing. So if you normally sit down with your partner at the end of the day and sit on the couch or sit in the kitchen and kind of sit and chat and catch up, think about how you could do that walking, like take a walk around the block or throw a football, to each other while you're catching up. If you usually sit while you're opening your mail, how could you maybe stand at your kitchen counter and do that instead? There's other things like treadmill desks, and there's actually really incredible research about walking desks and standing desks. And so finding ways to move more throughout the day, because what that actually does is keeps our mitochondria more active, keeps our glucose channels at the cell membrane, which just exercising for 1 hour can't change the rest of the day like that. And then to get to the question of stress, I end the book with stress for a very specific reason. My favorite chapter of the book is called Fearlessness, the Highest Level of Good Energy. And the reason it's so important is that even if food is perfect and sleep is perfect and all of this stuff is perfect, if we are living in a sense of constant stress, constant fear, that's going to create a biologic reality in the body that is going to be diverting resources towards defense and fear mitigation rather than to thriving and repair and healthy function of our cells. I think it's also foundational because the world we're in right now, the fact that we have a device in our hands, literally within 5 feet of us, 24 hours a day, that can stream the fears and trauma and anxiety of 8 billion people at all times to our eyeballs, that might be the most unnatural thing about our modern world, because at our core biologic level, we are primed to pay attention to fearful things because we need to protect ourselves. Like, we need to make sure that we're safe. And, these are evolutionary instincts. And we've been hijacked. The body needs to feel a sense of deep safety to be metabolically healthy. And that means that we have to take stock of what the fear triggers in our life are and work to overcome. And that doesn't mean fix them all in our environment. It means creating the mental safety for ourselves to basically let our cells hear a sense of safety so that they can do their best work. And a point I make in the book is that, again, the system, the media, the healthcare system, even the food system, all benefit off us being afraid. And they are going to fuel it. Because if we're afraid and if we're fearful, we are going to be consuming anything that can comfort or mitigate our anxieties outside of us. We're going to be consuming products and services that are going to somehow ameliorate our existential angst. So there's a wake-up call in here, too, about understanding this vortex that we're in of manufacturing fear and then profiting off our fear that we actually do have to wake ourselves up from. And this is not to say put your head in the sand. It's not to say ignore some of the awful societal things that are happening. It's about creating a sense of safety inside your body so that your cells can make the good energy they need to power properly so that you can show up to spread the best light in the world, so that you can show up to have the energy to do the work that needs to be done to create a better world, so that we're not getting crushed by the fear industrial complex that we're totally just like living in right now. And so that's a very, very important piece of it too. And with the mental illness rates in our country right now are absolutely astronomical. And a slightly morbid, but I think important point to sort of internalize is that we sort of accept in our Western culture that we should be like super afraid of death. We're a very death phobic culture. And when you actually look at a lot of other cultures in the world, indigenous cultures, Eastern cultures, many historical cultures, that's actually not a given. We are uniquely avoidant of talking about this concept. And of course, like, this is the biggest fear, right? It's like the fact that all of us, every single one, it's all guaranteed we're going to die. And I think what people don't realize is how much that avoidance of talking about it or having curiosity about it is used against us. Because the healthcare system, if you really think about it, in a way it weaponizes our existential lack of curiosity and fear of death against us. Because you can kind of get people to do anything, take the pill, get the surgery, if you've got them in this grip of fear.
Wow.
And of course, death is scary. We don't know what's on the other side. It's very scary, but it is our personal journey to examine that relationship so that we're not unknowingly being manipulated out of a fear that we don't even understand. I mean, you remember when COVID was happening, the CNN technical director was caught on an undercover camera saying, if it bleeds, it leads. You can get people to do a lot if you can get them clinging to some hope about mitigation of this fear of death. And so we have to do the job to make peace with it.
Yeah, I think I was talking to Deepak Chopra a few months ago, and he said when people get to the point of understanding like the kind of meaning of life and the experience of life, they do not fear death. And I think we think of that as this point in life we're never going to reach where we don't fear death. But I heard him say that, and I hear you say this, and it really does solidify that exploring this thing that has been so scary for so many of us for most of our lives may actually be part of the key to understanding that like there almost is like a lightness to life And there is levity, even in all of this conversation, there is so much levity. And that's where you're heading with your book is how do we recreate that experience of levity, including our acceptance of this journey and where it will continue or end. We don't know, right? So I'm curious, in your journey to creating good energy in your body, in your environment, probably with your family and your friends, what have been the meaningful shifts that have taken place in how they operate and how you operate in the world?
What a beautiful question. The way I would answer that is that fundamentally, I think part of our purpose, you were talking about purpose and Deepak Chopra. I think part of our purpose here as this entity, this unit of a person and a thing, it is to be a transformer of energy that's taking energy outside of us. I mean, us is really an illusion too, right? Because we're kind of this constantly dynamic, buzzing hive of matter that's constantly exchanging energy and matter with the surrounding world in total connection. But when we eat, we're taking in this potential energy from the outside world, from food, which basically is from the cosmos, right? It's outside of us. And we're converting it to a different energy that allows us to power all our feelings, all our thoughts, all our business ventures, everything, and reach our highest purpose, hopefully, which in my frame of reference is spiritual development, right? It's having the energy to fuel the ability to really seek that higher calling of like, where are we? How are we connected with everything? And this beautiful cycle. So to answer your question of what's changed, I find that when you start opening up this good energy metabolic framework, everything starts flowing. More creativity, more lightness, ease, just things moving, more intuition, more inspiration, because there's an openness, like sort of maybe on more of the spiritual level, I think like there's just a more effortless flow in all parts of our life that is fundamentally very joyful. So for me, when I was younger and I was dealing with my own metabolic dysfunction, I remember this was in my mid-20s when I was in my surgical residency, and I personally got pretty sick with metabolic dysfunction. And one of the ways it showed up was depression. I remember telling my parents, I read about this in the book, I felt like my world was in black and white, like I couldn't see in color anymore. I couldn't put the pieces together. And now I kind of realize it's like, when we block that flow on every level, things feel a little bit more black and white. And I want everyone to be able to kind of be living in color, and living in that synthetic, creative rainbow space. But that starts with having cells that are powered properly. And powered properly means transforming cosmic energy in the way that we're meant to. So that's kind of how I would sum it up. And what I'm confronting in this book is fundamentally disconnection on every level of our healthcare system. Disconnection between how we view diseases, disconnection with how we view the body as fragmented parts rather than a unified system, disconnection between our curiosity between life and death and an endless eternal cycle, disconnection between how we see ourselves and our food, water, air, sunlight. We're actually totally connected. And disconnection with our spiritual nature in our country. Like it's really fundamentally about connection. And I think a lot of that starts with powering ourselves properly.
I have chills. I'm like, what a beautiful way for you to sum that up. And I love how you say, I'll just kind of sum it up this way. I'm like, that's a beautiful statement. That feels really powerful. Casey, I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements for me. The first is better humans are.
This is a beautiful question. Better humans are well-powered.
Better work is.
Where we have the flow of creative energy of source flowing through us in an unbridled way.
And a better world has.
A better world has a deeper sense of our miraculous true nature as human beings and a better sense of our total cosmic, beautiful interconnectedness with everything else in the universe.
Oh, that makes me want to cry. Thank you so much, Casey, for being here and sharing just all of your knowledge and your purpose for your life as it stands right now, which is really spreading this amazing information about how we create good energy for ourselves and become the best versions of who we can be. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for all the amazing light that you are spreading with your work. And it's just really incredible. I'm so grateful to be on your show and so great to be connected.
That was Dr. Casey Means, author of Good Energy, co-founder of Levels, and Stanford-educated physician. Her book is out today, so you can find it wherever you get them. One big thing before we go. If this conversation felt overwhelming or confusing, it's totally normal. I felt the same way when I first heard Casey on a podcast a few years ago. What I'd recommend is focusing on learning more, starting small, and owning your health as much as you can. Maybe try adjusting just one thing, like your sleep consistency, or adding a walk in after your next meal, which is also known to support your metabolic health. Ultimately, self-experimentation is key, and as Casey says, trust the messages you get from your body. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with the first person who comes to mind. You never know how it could help them. And support other people like you in finding our show by leaving us a rating before you go. While you're at it, write a one-sentence review telling me what you love about Everyday Better. And as always, you can get me in your inbox by signing up for our weekly personal development newsletter, giving you practical tips on how to level up with small steps every day. Find it at linkedin.com/everydaybetter. That's linkedin.com/everydaybetter. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Alexis Ramdow. Our associate producer is Grace Rubin. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. He makes sure we sound good in the studio. Joe DeGiorgi mixed our show. Enrique Montalvo is the executive producer of LinkedIn Editorial Productions. Dave Pond is head of news production. Courtney Koop is head of LinkedIn Original Audio and Video. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.